I will start with introducing myself and SEAJunction. My name is Rosalia Sciortino, and I am the founder and director of SEAJunction, and SEAJunction is the place you see here. So it's a public venue focusing on Southeast Asia, all aspects of Southeast Asia, and today is a friend, so I am quite happy to have this opportunity. Allan Beesey, who is there, is an old friend working on development for many years here in Thailand and in the region, and he will be talking about the book that he has just written, which is related to the experience of Thailand seen through the eyes of Isan woman, and it is a particular woman. He will tell us more. But before we start, we have the pleasure to have a dance from Isan to be in the same tone as the book. We will have a dance by Omnet. It's an organization working with domestic workers here in Bangkok, and we have some women from Isan who will dance according to Isan music. So please. thank you very much for this beautiful dance. And I think everyone applause. Well, yeah, okay. So, and then we'll do another one before the end of the event. But now it's time to hear from Allan. Please. Yes, of course. And I will get also a seat later on, but maybe you can start. We are going to have a presentation, but maybe you can start to say something about the book.
Okay, thank you. Oh, yes, all right. Thank you, and thank you for that dance. What a wonderful introduction to a book on Isan. This book has been a long time in the making, and a lot of the book is about the culture of Isan, and particularly about social change over the last 50 years, because it follows one woman's journey over the last 50 years. And looking at the contextual changes and also the relationship between Isan and central Thailand. And in fact, it goes back, the book starts in 1971 when Pon, the person, the woman who was the principal protagonist, was born. So it starts with her birth and goes right through to the present. And it even goes back further into the history of how Isan, a part of Lao culture, a part of Lao ethnicity, has a different history to that of Siam, became part of Siam. So I'll talk a little bit about that as well. The book started out as a blog about 15 years ago when I was going to Sisaket. I was in a relationship with Pon for a number of years in the early 2000s. But after we separated, we stayed as good friends, and I remained a good friend of the family. And we continued travelling up to Sisaket. Sisaket is about as east as you can go before you meet Laos. The province after Sisaket is Ubon Ratchathani, and that borders with Laos. And both those provinces border with Cambodia. So it's a very remote part of the world, or at least it was in 1971 when Pon was born. And of course she was born at a particular time when a few years after she was born, of course, Pol Pot was in power. And then across the border in Laos, there was some of the heaviest carpet bombing you could imagine coming from the US in the Indo-China War. Yes, here we go. So, on the left-hand side, we have Lao girls. This is circa 1919. And we're talking about Lao because, as I said, it's ethnic Lao. Now they're Thai nationals. And the government, of course, worked very hard from late 19th century, but particularly through the 20th century, to make the Lao people Thai national citizens, to try and make them forget that they were actually Lao. It's up until today, it's particularly difficult because we often refer to Isan people eating Lao food, playing Lao music. It's hard to get rid of that word Lao, even though the government has tried very hard. The next picture in the middle is Lao Girl in 1973, a picture taken by John Burgess. And then, of course, you can see Lao girls of today, or a little bit older than girls, some of them. And to your right, this is Pon, and this is her sister Ket, who will feature in the ongoing story. This is a temple in Sisaket. So we're talking about Sisaket province. This temple, not in its current form, was reportedly established in 1815. In 1915, they celebrated their 100-year anniversary. Pon's grandmother was 15 years old. This temple has been in the family all that time. Probably Pon's ancestors saw this temple built, and then it was central to their life throughout the 20th century. In fact, I think that they have probably been feeding the monks at this temple for the whole of the 20th century. I'm talking about the people in the village, and I'm talking about Pon's family. Grandmother, mother, and now sister. They get up at 4 o'clock in the morning and prepare the very best food they can and feed the monks on their bindabao, on their alms rounds each morning. So Pon's grandmother was born in 1900. And I met her in 2002. She died in 2003. She was incapacitated in 2002, but she was still alive and somewhat conscious. And it was remarkable that I was able to meet her. Now we're moving on to the 1950s. In the 1950s, this is not in the book, but I thought it was a nice depiction of, the right-hand side is a nice depiction of villages back then, and Pon was probably born into a somewhat similar environment. But the America was very involved in the Thai administration and in social and political activities in Thailand at the time. And northeast Thailand was a target. And the Americans built roads and tried to help the Thais infiltrate Isan, if you like, because some people were living in Isan after the 1973 coup, or the 1976 coup, I'm sorry, when people fled to the hills to escape the military in Bangkok. And so on the left side, their heading is communists. So this was propaganda from the US government about communists in Thailand, and which would you choose, that or this? A little bit misleading, but nonetheless. So we're talking about subsistence farming. As I said before, Pon was born in 1971. Probably a turning point for subsistence farming turning into the market economy. So this book, in part one, covers 1970 up until 2000, and then part two up until the present. So the market economy happens in 1970s. It's probably happening before that, but in Isan, it's taking off in the 1970s. A lot of crops that would be being grown in central Thailand were now shifted to Isan. And so a lot of transformation went on because of the market economy. Although a lot of people will argue that perhaps more transformation, social transformation, went on in the first 50 years of the 20th century than in the last 50 years, despite the incredible social change because of the market economy. But in the first half of the century, there was a lot of cultivation of rice and increased populations. And it wasn't until the 1960s and 1970s that the population slowed down quite a bit. And of course, migration was happening. Probably in the 1960s, there was quite a lot of migration, mostly to central Thailand, around Bangkok and surroundings. Ket, Bon's sister, left when she was 18 years old on the long train ride. She'd never been out of the province before, and then all of a sudden she was on a long train ride to Bangkok, where friends of friends had arranged for her to live with people, and she was working and cleaning in a small factory and looking after children. And then Ket is illiterate. She never went to school. This is not uncommon for women of her age group. She was born in 63. Pon went to school, finished primary school. She actually started secondary school, but she was having trouble at school. All the schools are supposed to be in Lao language and Thai language, but she was at a school where most of the people were speaking the language of an ethnic minority called Suet or Kui, and she was finding it quite difficult. She was very frustrated, and she was thinking about her sister in Bangkok, and she was thinking of her sister maybe eating sweets, which they hardly ever get, or seafood, which they never get in Phuket. And she talked her parents into going to Bangkok to work with her sister. So this is pictures taken not so long ago. This is what the rural life was like there. The traditional houses on stilts. These were probably built around the 1980s. In Pon's house was built in the 1980s. Around about the same time they got electricity in the early 1980s. Some places in Isan didn't have electricity till the mid-90s, so a little bit later. So, part two, we're moving into the 21st century. So I was visiting Sisaket with Pom and loving her, of course, but realising the levels of poverty that there were, the hardships in Sisaket, which was at the time and still is one of the poorest provinces of Isan. And Isan is the poorest region of Thailand. And yet Thailand's economy was booming. The economy was doing quite well in the 70s, and it took off in the mid-80s and was doing very well right up until the financial crisis, 1997. So here's a few details about Pom's life. SUN stands for Sudden Unexplained Death Syndrome. Is there a Thai word for this? Does anybody know? I can't recall. Bob, do you know? No. But mostly working age men were dying from this syndrome, and it's been well documented in Singapore amongst Isan migrant workers and Isan migrant workers elsewhere. And then in 2006, Pom's sister, her husband died. Pom woke up one morning to find her husband dead beside her. And then Noi, her sister, her husband died just before they went to sleep one night. He was dead just after they went to bed. And in documentary, in looking at Pom's life, 3 times she has started out anew with no savings, with a little bit of money and nothing much to support herself. And she's had to go and find a job. She's got to find a place to live. And this is the story of so many Isan migrants coming to Bangkok. This is Pom's mother. She was born in the 1930s. The little girl is the third sister, Noi's little girl, who was in the womb when the father died in 2006, and it was her third child. So she was left with 3 children when her husband died. This is about the time when I started writing a blog, and I raised money from friends in Australia to help build a house for her. And in the other picture is Eve, Pom's daughter, who was 2 years old when her father died, and she's about 15 here. Now, these pictures are not in the book, and there's 2 reasons. There's reasons for both of them not being in the book. Pom's mother, when I was there, or when anybody from outside was there, she didn't like to open her mouth and smile very much, because she was a little bit embarrassed about the red staining from the betel nuts. And so I didn't want to put a picture in the book of her like that. But it was the anniversary of her death 10 days ago, And Pon actually posted this picture. It's, there it is, in full glory. As you can see in the other picture, she's got her mouth fairly tightly closed. And the story with Eve, I didn't want to put this picture in the book because it was a phase Eve was going through when she was 15 years old. She was a tom, which comes from the English tomboy. So it has connotations of having lesbian relationships, the Tom and the D. They are, Tom and D are both girls, but one is dressed like a male. And the D, which comes from the English lady, is dressed like a woman, and she is even a little bit more feminine than most women. And there's a lot of couples like this. Eve never admitted to being a Dom. She didn't want to be called Dom. So she doesn't like recalling that part of her life. And she doesn't like pictures of her with short hair at that period. So I didn't put that picture in the book either. So this is just a bit of the countryside. Down the bottom we have Da's mother walking through the rice fields. Pon is called, I called her Pon because that's her name in the village. But she changed her name at some period of time, and we know her as Da. So I might use those names interchangeably. And there she is, that's Eve, the little girl, and the son of her younger sister. And that's me, plain being farmer, with Milk, who was the daughter of the Pon's younger sister. So the Tom Yum Goong crisis. Some of you will not have heard of this crisis. It was the financial crisis of 1997. It was called the Tom Yum Goong apparently because of the hot and spiciness of the soup, which is very famous in Thailand. And the Thais weren't very welcoming of the IMF coming in to that crisis, and somehow it got this name, Tom Yum Goong. And Eve is referred to as a Tom Yum Goong baby because she was born in 1997. But during this time, up to 2 million people perhaps left Bangkok because there was no work for them. We don't know exactly how many, but there could have been that many. A lot of them had been in Bangkok for 10 years, 20 years. Some of them didn't realise how strong their connections were back in Isan because they'd been away so long. But a lot of people needed a safety net, and there was a safety net in Isan. Isan is a little bit unlike central Thailand or even northern Thailand in that most people have maintained their land, where there is much more landlessness elsewhere. And so even if people aren't into the market economy and growing crops so much these days, they've still got their land, they're still growing rice for eating mostly. They've still got ponds with fishing and so on. And we have, the same predicament occurred with COVID, of course. A lot of people had to go home. With the financial crisis, Ket, Pon's sister, and Pon were able to stay in Bangkok. They maintained their jobs in factories, but they weren't getting overtime. And working in a factory doesn't bring in a lot of money if you don't get overtime. Everybody wants to do overtime. Farming was becoming less profitable, and circular migration turned into a lot of long-term migration. More recently, we have self-sufficiency models of farming from the European term of the King's self-sufficiency, which became official policy quite a few years ago, although it hasn't been implemented all that well. And it was very similar to what a lot of NGOs were doing in Isan at the time with their local economy models. But in fact, some of these models didn't really fit into what was happening in modern Thailand, because people needed money. The self-sufficiency model wasn't separate from the market economy, but there may have been too much emphasis on being more self-sufficient rather than earning money and getting your child educated and getting good health and welfare and so on. Dams and people. So there's been a lot of environmental concerns in Isan. It's very arid in many areas. They have floods one year and droughts the next. The soil is deficient, and cropping has made the soil, a lot of overcropping has made the soil even more deficient. And eucalypts from Australia have made it even worse. They soak up a lot of water, they're hard to get rid of. And I talk about how Da's father planted eucalypts and then he wanted to get rid of them, but you needed machinery to uproot them. You needed a tractor. Of course, they didn't have a tractor. And then I talk about the dams on the Moon River. There's one not about 10 kilometres away from Da's village, and Da used to go fishing with her father up there with a pond. And then they built a big dam there. The dam was mainly for irrigation, and it didn't work very well. All the wetlands disappeared, and a lot of people were relocated. And then, after that disaster, they decided to build another dam, a hydro dam in Pak Mun, which has become very famous in Thailand. And Pak Mun was the first time that a big protest, like the Rasi Salai Dam, the one I'm referring to, was a big protest in Isan, just like the eucalypt projects which the military and the government were behind. It was a huge project, but huge protests, huge protests. They were going to green most of Isan with eucalypts. But the Pak Mun Dam was the biggest, and it came to Bangkok. They came to Bangkok, and they camped in Bangkok for many months until they got a response from the government through this organisation that was created, that emerged, the Assembly of Nepal. So civil society in Thailand is strong, and it has always been strong in Isan. Isan was called the hotbed of communist activity. Later on it became a hotbed of NGO activity. And so in the book I reflect on what happened in Thailand in 1973, the coup in 1976, again in 1992 when there's a lot of bloodshed on the streets, and then in 2010 there was a lot of bloodshed on the streets. And in 2010, again, it was Isan people who came into Bangkok after the emergence of the red shirts and Thaksin's government. Back to the family. So I'm looking at changes in Isan, and there has been a lot of social and cultural change over time. I look at Buddhism and how Buddhism has changed and how it hasn't changed in many respects. But in the 21st century, there are more opportunities. More people are getting educated. And for the first time, a significant number of Isan people are getting tertiary education. They're getting degrees. And there's 3 women in this family that get degrees. There's no men this year. The 3 women have got degrees, and I talk about them. But Pon's family kept, and she met somebody working in a plastic bags factory decades ago, and they married, and they have been together ever since. And in 2000, Kat decided to go home and live back in the village after almost 20 years away. Her husband kept working, and then he had worked for over 20 years in plastic bags factory, so now he started up his own plastic bag factory. So entrepreneurship is happening. The whole family went into hop to establish this factory, and the factory has probably over the last 10 years showed very little profit, but it has employed a significant number of people in the family who have come down from Sisaket to work in the factory. So it has been quite helpful. And this is just pictures of people travel down from Sisaket. 9 months travel down, or 7 months travel down from Sisaket. 2 came from Bangkok for the blessing of the factory when it opened. And this monk down the bottom, he is blessing the machinery. And this piece of machinery wasn't working, so he's giving it extra blessing to try and get it to work. And this monk who's doing this, he's well known to Pon's family. And Pon grew up with this monk, and he has risen up the ranks. And he is the district head as well, and he's always been a close friend of Pon. And in fact, even when he was a monk, there was rumours about him and Pon being a couple, but it was only rumours. So entrepreneurs too. These are 2 women, cousins, close cousins. Their families live in the same compound as Pon's sisters and mother. They both, so I said there's 3 women who graduated from universities. It's these 2 women, and it's Pon's 3rd sister. So the Pon and her sister Kat were working in factories for 15 to 20 years, and some of the remittances that they sent home have gone to educate the 3rd sister into tertiary education, which they never had the opportunity to do. So by graduating from university, like June for instance, she was working in a factory with her husband, but she was working mostly in the office. She had computer skills from her university days, and her husband was semi-skilled as well. So they earned quite well. They were getting overtime. They worked at least 6 days a week. And they came home and they were able to start up a small business. Similarly with time. She was in Bangkok for about the same period of time, was able to save money, was able to come home. And partly how they saved this money is Jung had 2 children. The children were raised in the village. Normally, children are raised in the village. This happens so much in Thailand. This is why grandparents are so important, because they're raising children all over Isan. It just makes it so much easier. And Pong, of course, her daughter Eve, she has never been a parent of it. She has never parented her because Dan has always been outward, Pong has always been outward, and Eve has always been. Firstly, she was looked after by the grandparents, and then when Kat moved back to the village in the year 2000, she took over the responsibility for Eve. So, now Pong is a parent, and this is her with Eve. And this is the house on my property in Kuwait. Pong wanted a house, and I had a property, and I already had a house, and we worked together to build this house on my property. And for the first time ever, Eve has graduated from university, so she's the 4th woman, still no men, graduated from university in the family. And ever since COVID, she graduated right at the beginning of COVID and came to live in Kuwait. We just built the house, it wasn't ready, and Pong had no intention to move in at this point in time, but it was under quarantine and we had nowhere else to stay. There was nowhere else to stay, and so we had to quickly get the electricity on and the water on, and they've been living together very happily, and it's just so wonderful to see them get on so well together, because they have never lived together really for any length of time in Eve's 24 years until this point in time. Thank you. That's it.
So I think this was a very exhaustive chronicle of the life of Pong and of the change in Thai society. I open the floor immediately for any comments or questions, if you have. Okay, please introduce yourself. One moment. Yeah, one moment, because we are being broadcast. Yeah.
My name is Don. I live in Japan and in California part of each year, and come here part of the year. So my questions are 2 in number, but I wanted to also say great presentation. I learned a lot from you. Thank you. When people in Isan, people born there, if they have property and can they make enough to survive, like just surviving on the property, or is it taxed by the government? And my second question is, today, in the 21st century, there are many opportunities for people to get jobs throughout Thailand, but people, is there a prejudice for those people to go somewhere else? Are they facing prejudice outside of Isan because they travel for work somewhere else?
Sorry, I didn't get the second half. A preference or a prejudice?
Prejudice against Isan people.
Okay.
Yeah, discrimination, yes.
I take another question if there is, or comments. Okay, please. One more.
What is the role of the spirit world in Isan? I miss it as a subject.
Okay, I think you can start to answer this question and then we will do another round.
I have to say they're the most important questions you could ask. There's bilateral inheritance in Thailand, so women and men are getting land. And of course, over time, the land gets quite small. And as I was saying before, the soil is quite deficient in many respects. And the crops aren't bringing in a lot of money. And in the 21st century, I think the only way to make money is some sort of niche farming. Organic rice is quite popular these days. But I'm wondering, I'm getting the impression from my reading that people are going back to subsistence, moving away from the market economy, in the sense that they're perhaps relying on remittances and they're being fairly self-sufficient. And in this way, because welfare isn't very good in Thailand, this really helps families an awful lot. So, most people are still growing rice, but a lot of it is for subsistence. Most people are eating sticky rice, and so they're not growing so much plain rice. But they'll grow both often, and if they have a surplus, they can sell it. In Sisaket, for instance, they don't eat so much sticky rice. Sisaket, Buriram and Surin eat a fair bit of plain rice, and particularly in Sisaket. It's different to the rest of Isan. So I think people seem to be living more of a self-sufficient lifestyle, and if they're getting regular remittances from the city, they're happy to keep it that way. It's an interesting area that needs further discovery. Now, Isan people are regarded as backward in many respects. Most Isan people have darker skin. The average central Thai is not so dark, and Thais are very good at keeping out of the sun, so they're not getting very dark, but particularly if they're not working out on the farm. So, you know, if dark-skinned people in Bangkok are often thought of as being from Isan, and people are very aware. You know, there's probably lots of different cultures happening in Bangkok at the same time, but you know, two distinct cultures is represented by the political situation of the yellow shirts and the red shirts, for instance, where you have the middle classes and the lower working classes. The middle class represented by the yellow shirts, and the working classes represented by the red shirts. So discrimination has always been an issue for Isan people. Northern Thais, for instance, there's a lot of migration from Northern Thai, which is a fairly poor area of the country as well. But the different cultures that are up in Northern Thailand are usually not so dark either. The other thing that likens Isan to having some prejudice against it is they were probably the last region that were using buffalo to plough their rice fields. The picture I showed you before is called an iron buffalo, and that they started coming in the late 80s and the 90s, but in Isan they were still using real buffaloes up until fairly recently. And buffaloes are regarded as stupid, so the term buffalo is often used to talk about Isan people if they really want to denigrate them. So yes, there is some prejudice. The spirit world, that's a big question. I sort of talk about it in the book as if the spirits are living there alongside the people, as if the people see that the spirits are living and watching it all the time. And it's like they have a close relationship with the spirit world, and they know they have to propitiate the spirits, the rice spirits, the house spirits, the land spirits. They're all propitiated, and they're negotiated with, and they're seen as more immediate to their spiritual life, if you like, or their religious life than Buddhism is. Buddhism is more related to the afterlife. You generally make merit for the afterlife. You don't make merit so much with the spirits. You negotiate with the spirits. You give them food. You give them drink. And if everything turns out all right, you promise to give them more. So it's a very interesting relationship. And it's an interesting relationship between the monks or the temples in the spirit world, because they find it hard to distinguish themselves from that realm, even though Buddhism is supposed to be separate from that realm. And some learned monks will try and separate their world from that spirit world. It's a very difficult thing to do. Most of the monks themselves grew up in that world. They haven't left it behind. And it seems to me it's very strong with Isan now, that those beliefs, spirits, and they carry it with them. And Pong, who was, not lived in the village for any period of time for 30 years or more, still has spirits, and she does rituals every year around Chinese New Year for propitiating the land that we live on.
So any other question, comments? Also someone from Isan? Maybe you can share your experience. Thai is okay.
ขออนุญาตพูดไทยนะคะตามหลักแล้วพวกเราที่เป็นคนอีสานนะตัวไก่เองไก่ไม่ได้เป็นคนอีสานแต่ว่าก็อยู่ใกล้ๆแต่ว่าได้สามีทางบุรีรัมย์เนาะก็ทางนั้นเขาก็ไม่ชอบอะค่ะไม่ชอบที่ใครจะมาเรียกพวกเราว่าลาวเนาะลาวแล้วก็โง่เหมือนควายอย่างเงี้ยค่ะก็ไม่ชอบนะคะแต่ว่าตามหลักแล้วพวกเราก็ทานเราไม่ได้ทานเฉพาะข้าวเหนียวอย่างเดียวนะคะเราทานหลากหลายมากเมื่อก่อนตอนที่ไก่เป็นเด็กๆนะคะทางบ้านไก่กินข้าวเหนียวค่ะเราก็จะมีเพื่อนบ้านที่มาจากต่างหมู่บ้านเขาทานข้าวเจ้าเราก็เอาข้าวเหนียวเนี่ยค่ะ1 ขันเนี่ยไปแลกข้าวเจ้าเขาแล้วก็มาหุงตอนนั้นเราใส่น้ำปลาปลาหมึกเนาะมันอร่อยมากเลยค่ะยังนึกถึงความหลังครั้งเก่าๆที่เราเคยได้ทานข้าวกับน้ำปลาตอนนี้กลับบ้านไปก็ยังรู้สึกแบบอยากทานข้าวกับน้ำปลาแบบนั้นเวลาที่เรากลับบ้านเรา
So she herself is not originally from Isan, but her husband is from Isan. For Isan people, they don't like being called Lao or to being called as buffalo. And as for the food, Isan people eat various things, not only sticky rice. There was time when she exchanged with her neighbor another type of rice, and then she also eat the sticky rice and rice with fish sauce, and it always her memory. Like she always recall the moment and like to eat it more.
Thank you very much. Any other? No? If so, I think wait, don't run away because we still have an applause for Allan first. We still have one performance from our friends and also we will have, unfortunately, sticky rice. Sticky rice with papaya and some other Isan food to celebrate the launching of the book. And the book, of course, is available for you at 450 baht, special price today. And thank you for coming, because I say goodbye now, but we are going to continue the discussion over the food. So maybe first the performance, and then I will say goodbye at the end. Maybe, Allan, you can move to this place. Please. Okay, one more. Yes? And then later on I will close the lamp. for sale for 160,000. 450 Thai bahts, no thousand. And then after you eat, please also give a donation so that SEAJunction can continue to undertake this kind of activity on your way out. So please enjoy the food. Thank you again, Allan, for launching your book here. Thank you to the friends of ONNET for the dance and music, and thank you to all of you for coming. Thank you.